محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم القيامة. نوينا التعلم والتعليم والتذكر والتذكير والنفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله تعالى وسنة رسوله وابتغاء مرضاته سبحانه وتعالى. اللهم إنا نسألك فهم النبيين وحفظ المرسلين وإلهام الملائكة المقربين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين يا أرحم الراحمين يا أرحم الراحمين. أما بعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We thank and we praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for His continuous favors that He has bestowed upon us, and from amongst those favors that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows you and I every day of our lives, He gives us a chance and He allows many of us to pray to Him 5 times a day. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, وَجَعَلْتُ قُرَّةُ عَيْنِي فِي الصَّلَاةِ, that I made the apple of my eye, I made the most beloved thing to me salah. So we should try to be of those, the followers of the Prophet ﷺ, we should try to be of those who make the most beloved thing to us, our salah. Meaning that we should focus in our salah, we should try to understand the conditions and the pillars of salah, the fiqh of salah, and we should understand what to recite in salah. And from amongst the favors that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala favored upon us is that He allowed you to sit in a gathering in which you learn more about Him subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we continue to speak about the last attribute from the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the act of attributing speech to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, kalam. And then after this we will go speaking about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Then we will speak about what is a prophet, what's the difference between a prophet and a messenger, Rasul and a Nabi, and the definition of each one, and then we would give a brief explanation of each prophet. Right? So in the say speak about the attribute of kalam, the attribute of speech to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? He says, معنى الكلام في حقه جل وعلا صفة قديمة بذاته ليست بحرف لأن الحروف حادثة. The first thing he says that speech is an attribute given to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but without letters. Why? Because letters are considered an incident. Right? Letters are something that he explains further when he says why letters are an incident, because it's something that was created. Right? And if it was something that was created, it needed a trigger, something to create it. And if something needed to create it, if we're saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke with something that needed creation, then that would mean that He's in need of it. And He's in need of it. If He is in need of it, then that would mean that He needed something to provide for Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he says that laysat biharf. The first thing is that the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has no letters. Right? Like our speech has letters. When I say speech, S-P-E-E-C-H, it has letters. Right? The speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bila harf. Why? Because harf is haditha, it's an incident. وصفة الكلام بحقه تعالى منزه عن التقدم والتأخر والإعراب والبناء الذي هو دليل الحدوث. And that the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free from past tense, future tense, present tense. Right? When they say i'rab means when you study Arabic grammar, it's the way that you break up the words and explain each word. Right? It's free from that. And he says bana, meaning the building of each word to make sentences, or the building of letters to make words. Right? The speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free from this. Then he says, why? Because each of these things, if you find these things in speech, it proves that the speech is hadith, and hadith is an incident. Right? So he says, فعندما نقول مثلا, he gives an example, he says زيدا فقبل أن ننطق بالزاي أين كان زاي. He said that if we say the name Zaid, right, and we explain it in English, in English we explain it, if you say Zaid, right, the Z in Zaid, before you said Zaid, where was that Z? Right? Before you said Zaid, before you said the Z, the A, the I, and the D, where were all of those letters? It wasn't there. It's you speaking, right? You're not talking about anyone else speaking. When you spoke, before you said Zaid, was that word there before? It wasn't there. Right? So you just speak about the Z. He says, when you say Zaid, where was the Z before you said it? He says, كَانَ مَعْدُومًا ثُمَّ وَجَدَ. He said that it was not there, then when you said it, it came into creation. Right? Because before you said Zaid, there was nothing. Then he says كان معدوما ثم وجد. Right? So it wasn't there, it came into creation. Then he says ومثله الياء والدال وهكذا كل حروف من حروف المتغير من العدم إلى الوجود. Then he says every letter in the alphabet, right? We say A, B, C, D, E, Arabic alphabet, alif, bata, any letter. Before you say it, it's non-existent, right? And any other letter that changes, right? Any other letter that changes, that came from nothing into creation once you said it, right? Which means that is an incident, because the trigger, what was the trigger? If you say it was an incident, needs a trigger. What was the trigger? The trigger was you speaking. When I say Zaid, right, the incident happened because of my speech, so my speech was the trigger. This is وَكُلُّ مُتَغَيِّرٍ مِنَ الْعَدَمِ إِلَى الْوُجُودِ حَادِثٌ. Right, everything that changes, like we explained in the first class, we explained this. كُلُّ مُتَغَيِّرٍ مِنَ الْعَدَمِ إِلَى الْوُجُودِ حَادِثٌ. Anything that changes from non-existence into a state of existence is hadith. Right, like anything that changes in general is hadith. We gave the example, the fan, right? Now it's off. If you press the switch, it moves, right? So it changed from a stagnant state to a moving state, right? The switch was the trigger, right? And every trigger needs an incident. So everything, كل متغير من العدم إلى الوجود حادث. Everything that changes from a state of non-existence into a state of existence is considered hadith, is considered an incident. And he says, وصفة الكلام في حقه تعالى. The first point was that it doesn't have letters, right? He says, وصفة الكلام في حقه تعالى ليست بصوت. That the attribute of speech to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't have sound. When we speak, there's sound, right? There's letters and there's sound. You can hear me speaking. So he says, لأن الأصوات أيضا متغير. Because sounds also change, which means that it's an incident, right? Sounds also change. I can speak like this, I can speak lower, I can speak higher, right? It changes. Everybody sounds different. So he says, فَهِيَ حَادِثًا. Why? Because it changes. وَلَا يَجُوزَ أَن تَكُنْ صِفَةٌ مِنْ صِفَاتِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى حَادِثًا. He says again that it's not allowed for any of the characteristics of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be haditha, to be an incident, to be something that was brought into creation, to be something that was in a state of non-existence and be brought into existence. And he says, third point. First, that it has no letters. Then, it has no sound. Right? Third point, that وصفة الكلام في حقه تعالى أيضا منزه عن السكون النفسي. بأن لا يدبر في نفسه الكلام القدرة عليه. Meaning that the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it doesn't need thought. Right? سكون النفسي. He says, بأن لا يدبر نفس الكلام القدرة عليه. Says, when we say something, right, most of the time we think about it before we say it, right? When we say something, we think about it. Or if we want to give an answer, we think of the answer first. He says the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free from this, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not need to think about something or pause before He does something. وَمُنَزَّةٌ عَنِ الْآفَةِ الْبَاطِلِ. And it's free from any inner faults, right? بألا يقتل على ذلك. Inner false meaning, or you could say is free from any deformities, right? If you say speech, any deformities means someone that can't speak, right? Someone that's not able to speak. Someone is not able to speak, or a child, right? A child can't speak. Says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free from these things. Because these things, these children, babies, they can't talk. Right? And people that have a sickness are not able to talk, or deaf people, most of the time they can't talk. Right? So this is because these are considered faults, and like we said, that faults are removed from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because like we mentioned, the meaning or the definition of a God is that is muttasif bi jamil kamalat, He is attribute with all forms of perfection, wal munazzah an kulli naqs, and any fault or any deformity is taken away from Him. Right? So you find the fault that cannot be connected to Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when you speak about the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, firstly, it has no letters. Secondly, it has no sound. Thirdly, it does not need thought to before we say something, you don't need to think about it, right? And then if you think about it, you think so, then how does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talk? How does his speech work? Because when we speak, it needs letters, it needs sound. Sometimes you ask the question, you need time to think, right? Like we said before, كُلُّ مَا خَطَرْ فِي بَالِكَ فَاللَّهُ خِلَافَ ذَلِكَ. Everything that you can think about or imagine, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is different from that, right? So then he speaks often about the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then he goes into an issue about the Quran, right? Understanding the Quran. He says, firstly, وَتَعْرِفْ كَلَامُ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى بِمَعْنَى كَلَامِ النَّفْسِ الْقَدِيمِ. When this definition, the 4 points that we mentioned before, speaking about the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, meaning the speech of the essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? لأن الكلام الله تعالى يطلق على معنى. Because when we speak about the speech of Allah subhanahu, about the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right, there's 2 meanings, right? The first one is فَيُطْلَقَ عَلَى كَلَامِ نَفْسِهِ الْقَدِيمِ. The first one is that it speaks about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, about his speech, right? Meaning that the 4 points that we mentioned before, that's the first meaning. It says كَمَا يُطْلَقَ عَلَى الْكَلَامِ اللَّفْظِ بِمَعنَى أَنَّهُ خَلَقَهُ تَعَالَى. The second one is, it's called kalam lafzi, right? Lafzi is letters. So he says أَنَّهُ خَلَقَهُ تَعَالَى, that these words or these phrases or these sentences Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created, right? That's why some people will say the Quran is kalamullah, right? Because it was created. But the Quran is creation. He says وَلَيْسَ لِأَحَدْ فِي أَصْلِ تَرْكِيبِ كَسَبٍ. Says that it's words that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created, but nobody else is able to send it down like this. Nobody else is able to explain it like this. Nobody else is able to word it the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put it down. Right? So he says, وَعَلَى هَذَا الْمَعْنَى يَحْتَمِلُ قَوْلِ سَيْدَ عَيْشَةَ. Then through this meaning, the second one, kalam lafzi, right, explains the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, مَا بَيْنَ دَفْتَيِ الْمُصْحَفِ كَلَامُ اللَّهِ. That what is between the books of the Mus'haf is what we call it the Quran, right? The Quran is the speech, the kalam, that's the Quran, the speech. The book is called the Mus'haf. Here we call it the Quran. In Western countries, we call it Quran. If you go to Arab countries, you go to Tahrir, you go to Egypt, then you ask them where, then they will say, give me a Mus'haf. They won't say, give me a Quran, right? So they say, مَا بَيْنَ دَفْتَيِ الْمُصْحَفِ كَلَامُ اللَّهِ. That was what is between the covers of the Mus'haf, that there, the book, is the Kalamullah. Meaning that what is written there, right, that's the Kalamullah. وَكُلُّ مَنْ أَنْكَرَ أَنَّ مَا بَيْنَ دَفْتَيِ الْمُصْحَفِ كَلَامُ اللَّهِ فَقَدْ كَفَرَ. And anybody who disagrees with us, that says that these words were given to us from a man, so how can it be the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? It says anybody that believes that what is between those 2 covers is not the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, فَقَدْ كَفَرَ. He's a kafir, right? إِلَّا إِذَا لَمْ يُرَدُّ بِهِ الْكَلَامِ النَّفِيسِ الْقَدِيمِ بَلْ أَرَادَ بِاللَّفْظِ الَّذِي نَقْرَأُهُ. Except that what he meant by that is that what you are reading, what is written there, is not the speech of Allah, right? Meaning, if somebody says that this is not the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but he means that this wording was given to us by a man, so it can't be the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he completely rejects it. That person is kafir. But if somebody comes and he says that the writing here is not the kalam, is not the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right, then he's right. Because that's hadith, it's an incident. What is the trigger? It needed to be written down, right? It was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said this and it showed up on the page, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed it to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he read it out to the Sahaba, and that time they used to write it down, whatever they could find. They wrote it on stones, they wrote it on bones, and then afterwards they compiled into the Mus'haf, right? So if somebody says that we're talking about, somebody says that this is not the speech of Allah, but he means this, the writing, right? He is not kafir. This is the problem, you have to explain to him, but he's not kafir, right? because we know we like to jump to conclusions. We hear first if we explain the first part, I'll explaining this part now, and then anybody's kafir. We will just say somebody's kafir immediately, right? We like jumping to conclusions. But if somebody says that the writing there is not the kalam of Allah, is not the speech of Allah, is not kafir. If somebody says that no, the Quran is not the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because we heard a man give it to us, then he's kafir. Right? You understand? And he says, لا يجوز أن يقال القرآن حادث إلا في مقام التعليم. You're not allowed to say or believe that the Quran itself is hadith. Not the Mus'haf, the Quran. Right? You can't believe that the Quran is an incident. إلا في مقام التعليم. Except you cannot even say that the Quran is an incident. We're not talking about Mus'haf, we're talking about the Quran. Right? You must understand the difference. You can't say that the Quran is an incident إلا في مقام التعليم, except if the teacher says it, explaining you the lesson. Or except if you ask a question about it. But anywhere else you're not allowed to say it. Alright? Then he says, why? Because لفظ القرآن يطلق أيضا على صفة القائمة بذاته تعالى. فربما يتوهم من إطلاق أن القرآن حادث أن صفة القائمة. He explains, he says, why don't we do this? Because if you're going to go to everybody and you're going to tell them the Quran is an incident, the Quran is creation, right? If you're going to go to anybody and tell them this, and then some people might think, right, that because saying the Quran is creation, so the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is creation, right? Some people, they think like this. They don't think, if you say something, their minds process the worst possible result. Right? So if you go tell them that no, the Quran is creation, it goes to the head that the kalam of Allah is creation. There's incident. And if they believe that the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is creation, is kufr. Right? Then he says that is أما ما ورد في النصوص سواء في القرآن أو في السنة مما يدل ظاهره على حدوث كلام الله تعالى والتي تمسك بالمعتزلة لإثبات الحدوث كلام الله فهي محمولة على اللفظ المنزل. So anything proof from the Quran or the Sunnah, right? مما يدل ظاهره على حدوث كلام الله, that the apparent view of the hadith or the ayah, right? And we need to understand that we don't just look at the pen, we don't just look at the wording that's written there. If we look at the wording that's written, it becomes a problem. An example of lots of people, they read the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, he says that, he says suwar wal kalb, right? They say pictures and dogs, the malaika don't enter a house in which there are pictures and dogs, right? So they look at Zahirul Hadith. Now the problem is, if we look at Zahirul Hadith, we become very limited. And we make it very difficult upon ourselves. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, Yassiru wa la tu'asiru. He said, make it easy on the people, don't make it more difficult. So when you learn the Arabic language, you learn that one word can have up to 10 meanings. Right? One word can have multiple meanings. So the word surah, or the word suwar, it can mean a picture, it can mean a sculpture, it can mean a drawing, it can mean a statue, many meanings. Right? So Imam Nawawi, he goes and in his commentary of hadith, he comments on this hadith and he says that what was meant by this hadith is statues. Why? Obviously, people are going to ask why, because you can't just say what is meant by statues. They say because in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, people used to have small statues that they put in their houses and they used to worship those statues. So the Prophet ﷺ said that the house, the malaika will not enter your house if you have these statues in your house and dogs inside your house. Not dogs inside your house, right? Dogs running around your house and malaika will enter your house. But these statues, so that the people could remove these statues from their houses. But now people come, they read Zahirul Hadith, they make it difficult on everybody. They say, no, you can't have pictures, everything that's a bid'ah, it's kufr, it's shirk, because you have pictures in your house. The Prophet said, Yassiru wa la tu'assiru. Make it easy on the people, don't make it difficult. Right? And you make it easier on them when you actually You don't read a hadith or read something and understand it yourself. You go to somebody who learned it and studied it, and you learn from that person. Right? Because that person learned from a scholar, who learned from a scholar, who learned from the scholar, who learned from a scholar in continuous chain that goes up to the Prophet ﷺ. Right? And when we hear people like Imam Nawawi explaining the hadith, it's very difficult to go against, because Imam Nawawi was somebody who spent his whole life studying, spent his whole life learning. He was so engulfed in seeking knowledge that when they asked him one day, he was old at that time, right? So they asked him, why didn't you get married? So he said, oh, but I forgot. I was so busy studying and so busy learning. If you reminded me to get married, I would have gotten married. Because Imam Nawawi wasn't somebody that left the Sunnah, right? He was just so engulfed in learning and getting close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he sincerely forgot to get married. So if scholars like this explain the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? People who did tahqiq, meaning that they understood the hadith and they understood the explanations, then who are we to say something about it? Who are we to say, oh no, but I understand this, right? So when you say that we shouldn't look at just the apparent view, right? Even in the Quran we have a rule in usul that says al-ibra bi umumi lafz la bi khususi sabab, that the lesson we take from that ayah, right, is from, when we talk about Dahid, we talk about sometimes people see that the lesson that we take from the ayah, right, is not from the story behind it, but from what is written there. So sometimes people read the ayah speaking about the people of that time, right, or speaking about a certain group of people. Then they say, no, that was only for that people, right? The lesson you take from the ayah is that's for us, for you and I, right? Don't limit your understanding, but also don't widen your understanding with your own mind, right? Like we explained, that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in every time there are people to teach, in every time there are people to guide, right? So that we don't fall astray by ourselves. Because once we sit alone and we start learning by ourselves, and then you think, okay, I can understand this, so it's fine. Especially nowadays when we have English books, and you read and you say, this is easy, I can understand. Then at that time, shaitan comes to you. Then he whispers in your ear. Because shaitan doesn't only deceive you by telling you to do bad, shaitan can deceive you by telling you to do good. How? An example in Ramadan, shaitan comes to you, he tells you, see here, just recite some more Quran, or make some more Qiyamul Layl. That's fine. You make. It's an hour before Fajr, you want to take a nap. You say, no, make more, recite more Quran. It's fine. Or make more Sunnah Salahs, it's fine. And you go. 5-10 minutes before Fajr, he whispers in your ear. Now he come, he takes his opportunity. He says, go take a nap. You wake up before Fajr. And you go sleep, you wake up Dhuhr time. So you can deceive with either thing. Shaitan says that I'll come to them through every door. Any door you can think of, I'll come to them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that they will refuse you. If they are true, sincere servants of me, they will still refuse, they won't listen to you. But shaitan comes to you through every door. Right? So he says, أَمَّا مَا وَرَدَ فِي النُّصُوصِ وَفِي الْقُرْآنِ وَالسُّنَّةِ مَا يَدُلُّ ظَاهِرُ حُدُوثِ الْكَلَامِ. Whatever came in the Quran or the Sunnah, where the apparent view is that the kalam of Allah is an incident, right? وَالَّتِي تَمَسَّكْ بِالْمُعْتَزِلَةِ, and what the Mu'tazila believe that the kalam of Allah is an incident, فَهِيَ مَحْمُولَةٌ عَلَى اللَّفْظِ الْمُنَزَّلِ عَلَى سَيِّدِنَا مُحَمَّدٍ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ. What is meant by this, or the true understanding of this, is that the Mu'tazila, they have a misunderstanding, right? When we look past the apparent view, that whatever was mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah, that the Quran is an incident, is hadith, right? We're not talking about the kalam of Allah. We're not talking about the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're talking about the words that were revealed upon the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that came out of his mouth, right? Because when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said something, that is also hadith, because he said it, right? He used letters, he used words. Right? He said, he said Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. He said the Alif, he said the Lam, he said the Ha, he said the Mim, he said the Da. It's an incident. That's what is meant by that. He says the same as when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Inna anzalna fi laylatul qadr. Right? That we revealed it on the night of power. Right? And he explains further on, he says, Inna nahnu nazzalna dhikr. That we revealed the remembrance dhikr. وأما قوله تعالى ما يأتي من ذكر من ربي محدث إلا استمعوه وهم يلعبون. That he explains that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that no remembrance came to them from their Lord, right? محدث, that was an incident. إلا استمعوه وهم يلعبون. We said that they heard it and they understood it. And the ayah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala وما يأتي من ذكر من الرحمن محدث إلا كانوا عنها معرضين. And that nothing came to them from remembrance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the most merciful. That was an incident, except that they rejected it. Two different people. Right? The one group listened and they understood, the one group rejected it. It says, فَالْمُرَادْ بِهِ. The understanding from this is مُحْتَثِ النُّزُولِ. Right? The incident of the revelation. Right? Because there was no revelation, then it was revealed. So that's what they're talking about. أنه حادث في نزول الفاظ على قلب النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. That it is hadith, not the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but the revelation on the heart of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the speech of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam saying these ayahs of the Quran. Right? But that to the essence of the kalam of the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not, and it is not hadith. Then he explains that وَكَلَامُ اللَّهِ subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's generally, it's connected to three things. Wajibat, mustahilat, jaizat. Right? Things that are inevitable, things that are inconceivable, and things that are conceivable. An example of things that are inevitable is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Allahu la ilaha illa wa hayyul qayyum. Right? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one, there is nobody like him, and his hayyul qayyum is alive and he has power over everything. Wal mustahilat. Mustahilat, things that are inevitable, meaning when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَقَالِ اتَّخَذَ الرَّحْمَنُ وَلَدًا. Right? When they said about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had a son. وَقَالِ اتَّخَذَ الرَّحْمَنُ وَلَدًا. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had a son. It's mustahil, inconceivable. Right? Not like the Christians believe the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Right? They say that we have God, Jesus is the Son of God. Right? They used to say that Jesus was the Son of God. They used to say that the Malaika were the daughters of God. Right? These are things that are inconceivable. And things that are conceivable, خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the heavens and the earth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is conceivable. You can conceive there being no heavens, being no earth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have done it and he could not have done it subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And he says after that, وَكَلَامُهُ تَعَالَى لَيْسَ بِآلَةٍ. That the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is without any tools. Without any tools, meaning that when we speak, we need a tongue, we need lips, right? We need a voice box. If we don't have these things, then you can't speak. These are considered tools. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks without these things, because these things are all considered incidents. These things are all things given to creation. And we go back to the Qaida, like we said, that we always go back to this Qaida. كُلُّ مَا خَطَرْ فِي بَالِكَ فَاللَّهُ خِلَافْ ذَلِكَ. Anything that you can comprehend, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond this. So, without any tools. وَلَا يُوصَفُ بِكَوْنِي عَرَبِيًّا. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not attributed that he speaks the Arabic language, or that he speaks English, or that he speaks French, right? Or that he speaks any language, right? We don't attribute any language to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because all of these languages are considered incidents, right? All of these languages came from a state of nothingness into a state of creation, right? And things like that, with things that are brought into creation, need a trigger. Right? And like we confirmed in the first few classes, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not need a trigger. Then he says that the attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَكَلَامُ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى صِفَةٌ وَاحِدَةٌ. That is one attribute. Right? There's not many different attributes. When you say speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's not many different attributes. It's one attribute, that splits into different stages, right? So I say different stages, meaning that the Quran, or not the Quran, the Kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it either has, it says, حيث تعلق بطلب الفعل, asking you to do something. And that is called an amr, it's called the order, right? Or asking you to leave something, which is called nahi, right? To leave something. Or it's speaking about doing something to get a reward, right? That's called wa'ad. You do something, you get a reward, right? You do this for me, I give you a reward. It's called the wa'ad. And then there's also some ayahs that speak about you doing something and you get punished. That's called the wa'id, right? And when you see in the Quran, you read the Quran, you read some ayahs end with wa'ad and some ayahs end with wa'id, right? If it's wa'ad, it's a good promise that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving you. It's a blessing, a reward that you will get. If it says wa'id, then it's a punishment that you will get if you do this thing. Or it's a punishment that was given to those who did this thing, right? Because the Arabic language, both of these words, they mean a promise. Wa'ada, right? It means to promise. But the wa'ad is a good promise. Wa'id is, you could say, a bad promise, right? A punishment. And then something that speaks about stories about the prophets, stories about wars, any stories in the Quran is called ikhbar, right? So an example of amr, example of an order that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked you or told you to do something, is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَفْعَلُوا الْخَيْرِ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, do good, act upon good, right? وَفْعَلُوا الْخَيْرِ. An example of a wa'ad, right? A wa'ad is, like we said, a good promise, right? You do something for me, you get rewarded. So it says, وَأَمَّا مَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّي وَنَهَى النَّفْسَ عَنِ الْهَوَى فَإِنَّ الْجَنَّةَ هِيَ الْمَأْوَى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says that as for those who fear the status of their Lord, right, and they protect their nafs, or they protect their egos from themselves, or they protect their souls from their egos, they protect themselves from their egos, right? Because shaitan isn't your only enemy. You have shaitan, your ego is also your enemy, right? Your ego calls you to do bad, it's an enemy. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, those who protect themselves from the hawa, from the egos, from what the nafs want, right? Meaning, at any time you'll be walking, then your ego says, can we do this? Can we do something wrong? If you protect yourself from following what your ego wants, right? فَإِنَّ الْجَنَّةَ هِيَ الْمَأْوَى. There Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the good promise, the reward you get. فَإِنَّ الْجَنَّةَ هِيَ الْمَأْوَى. If you do this, then the Jannah will be your final abode. If you do this, then you will enter Jannah, right? And something beneficial about doing this, one of the scholars, Shaykh Junaid Dramat, used to do, some of the scholars would advise that you, to protect your nafs, or to control your nafs, you do something that the nafs doesn't like, right? But not something to hurt yourself. Sometimes people would say, you put a lesson, you think of something bad, you shoot yourself, right? You're not supposed to hurt yourself in Islam, right? Because remember, it's haram to hurt yourself. Shaykh Junaid Dramat used to, every time he thought of something bad, just thought, he didn't do anything, every time he thought of something bad, he used to have a bath filled with ice cold water, and he used to sit in that water until the thought went away, to kill his nafs, to fight his nafs, until his nafs gives up, and shaitan gives up that this thing isn't going to work on him anymore. Every time I try to do something wrong, he's going to go back in that water, and he's going to forget about it. An example of a wa'id, something that you do and you get punished for it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَأَمَّا مَنْ تَغَى وَآثَرَ الْحَيَاةَ الدُّنْيَا فَإِنَّ الْجَحِيمَ هِيَ الْمَأْوَى. As for those that turned away from me and rejected me, and when I gave them and explained something to them, they still turned away. فَأَمَّا مَنْ تَغَى وَآثَرَ الْحَيَاةَ الدُّنْيا. And they preferred this worldly life, this short life, they preferred this over the akhirah. فَإِنَّ الْجَحِيمَ هِيَ الْمَأْوَى. Then the jahim, the hellfire, Jahannam, will be their abode. Right? That's a wa'id. If you want to do these things that I told you, stay away from, if you want to turn away from me, if you want to reject me, then I'll give you a promise. I made a promise, I'll give you the promise, but the promise is Jahannam, not Jannah. Right? It's called a wa'id. And then example of ikhbar. Ikhbar is any story that was told, the story of Fir'aun, the story of Namrud, all the stories mentioned in the Quran is called ikhbar. Right? And now we go to the proofs. When we understand what is the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, go to the proofs. Dalil aqli, right? The logical evidence is that, like we said with the two other that we explained last week, that it's simply that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not attributed with kalam, lattasafa bididdi, you'd be attributed with the opposite of that. Right? And if somebody is attributed with the opposite of that, what's the proper terminology for somebody that can't speak? In English, speechless. But it's a word.
It's a mute.
A mute. If somebody couldn't speak, right, then he's a mute, right? And that is considered a fault. And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had a fault, then he cannot be considered a God. Like we explained, he said, وَلِتُصَفْ بِهِ نَقْص. That if you were to attribute Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the opposite of kalam, it would be considered a fault. وَالنَّقْصُ عَلَيْهِ مُحَالٍ. And any faults are inconceivable for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَدَلِيلْ نَقْلِ. Dalil from the Quran and Sunnah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَكَلَّمَ اللَّهُ مُوسَى تَكْلِيمًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He spoke to Sayyidina Musa. And He says with tawqeed, right? Tawqeed means to confirm something, right? He says, وَكَلَّمَ اللَّهُ مُوسَى تَكْلِيمًا. That is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He spoke to Sayyidina Musa. And He says taklima, that He spoke to Sayyidina Musa with speech. Right? To confirm that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala He spoke to Sayyidina Musa. He says, what we understand is that through this ayah Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala He spoke to Sayyidina Musa, to the point where Sayyidina Musa heard the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَلَمْ يَكُنْ حَادِثًا. And it wasn't an incident, right? Meaning that the Quran was revealed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? That the revelation is considered incident. But Sayyidina Musa, he spoke to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? I think that's it. Then after that, they speak about an attribute that is ikhtilaf, the difference. Right? It's called idrak. Idrak is when you come to understand something. Right? They say ikhtalafa ahl ilm, that the scholars of knowledge, they differ with this sifatul idrak. Right? Says, for us, idrak is tasawwur haqiqatu shay al-mudrak. Is when we look at something, then we understand what it is. Right? Yudriku shay, you understand. So if I look at this, I understand it's a book. If I look at this, I understand it's a ring. Right? So he says, so the scholars differ, right? But those that say it's an attribute, say it's an attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to samma al-idrak, yudriku biha kullul mawjud. That through this Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala He understands all of creation, everything in creation. Right? Yudriku biha mulammasat. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala understands if something is rough, if something is smooth, right? The different textures, wal mashmumat, right? Any smells, wal mawdhuqat, any tastes, without, he feels the texture without any hands, right? He tastes without any tongue, right? Without any parts, right? They said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala understands and feels all these things without any parts, idrak. So the scholars of knowledge that differ, there's three different. The one agrees, the one says ithbat, they confirm his attribute. The one says that is not the attribute. And the one says tawaqquf. So he says, the first group that says they understand this, and from Imam al-Baqalani and Imam al-Haramain, they said that the proof is annahu kamal. That why do we attribute this to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Because it's kamal. It's part of completion. Right? It completes the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wa kullu kamal wajib lillah. Why? Because the proof is that this character, this attribute is perfection. And every form of perfection is given to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. لأنه لو لم يتصف بها لتصف بذلها. Because if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was not attributed with this, with idrak, He'd be attributed with the opposite of it. وَهُوَ نَقْص, and the opposite of that is a fault. Right? وَنَقْص عَلَيْهِ مُحَالٍ. فوجب الاتصال. So he said النقص عليه محال, that a fault for him subhanahu wa ta'ala is uncomprehendable, right? So they will say إثبات, they confirm this. The other group says no, we don't confirm this as an attribute. Why? Because if we were to attribute this, they say we were to attribute this to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala لازم الاتصال بمحالها لزوما عقليا. Okay. They say that we remove this because if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was attributed with this, then that would mean that there would have to be a connection with the opposite of this, right? A connection, right? And this is a call of, I think it's most of the Mu'tazila, right? And this is وَهَذَا الْإِخْتِلَافِ بَيْنَ الْمَذْهَبَيْنِ, right? This is ikhtilaf between two. There's three madhabs, right? There's ikhtilaf between the two madhabs. And then he speaks about the third one. The third one is the best one. We have something called asla, right? That's the safest one. The one that you should follow. Whenever there's an issue where most people will agree on, there will be a group of people that will do something called tawaqquf. Right? So this is الثالث من المذاهب وقف عليه. Right? القول الإثبات أو النفي. وذهب إلى ذلك قوم متكلمين. He says that the second group, they did waqf on it. They stopped just there. They said that's if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has it. If he doesn't, he doesn't. Right? He says وهذا المذهب الثالث أسلم. That this madhab is aslam, it's safer. Right? Because you can argue and argue and argue, and then some people might fall into fault, some people might fall into shirk, some people might fall into kufr. So he said we do tawaqquf, we stop. Right? There's certain masail that we will stop on and we just stop, we do tawaqquf, because there's no point in arguing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has, wallahu a'lam. Right? They say, saying wallahu a'lam, nisful jawab. No, saying wallahu a'lam is, that's what. Fahmu su'al nisful jawab. That's something else. That's understanding the question of something is half of the answer. Right? But this is saying wallahu a'lam is, are you wrong? You're not wrong. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. If you don't understand something, and scholars that study and spend their whole life studying, they're arguing, and then a group of them say tawaqquf. And then you don't still argue. You say waqf, you stop there. Okay. Right? So he says this aslam, this is safer. Right? So we take this qawl. Right? وَالْأَصَحْ مِنَ الْقَوْلَيْنِ. And he says this is more accepted than the two other qawls, the two that were arguing. Then he speaks about it, rock, and then so something we would say, we would stop there. Right? The tawaqquf alayh. And then we're going to finish this last part. We start speaking about the different صفات الواجبة في حقه تعالى أربع أقسام. You have نفسية, you have سلبية, you have معاني, and you have معنوي. Right? صفة النفسية هي ما لا تعقل ولا تعرف الذات إلا بها. Right? It's the attributes that you not know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or not comprehend Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without these characters. And that's one, al-wujud. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being present. Characters an-nafsiyah, meaning that it has to do with that, the essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then he says, وَصِفَاتُ السَّلْبِيَّةِ. It's 5. Right? صِفَاتُ السَّلْبِيَّةِ, it's al-qidam, meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was pre-existent. Al-baqa, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is post-existent. مُخَالَفَةُ لِلْحَوَادِث, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is completely different from all of creation. And وَقِيَامُ بِنَفْسِي, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not in need of anything and is not in need of anyone. وَالْوَحْدَانِيَّة, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one. He says وَسُمِّيَتْ سَلْبِيَّةً لِأَنَّهَا سَلَبَتْ وَنَفَتْ عَنِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى نَقَائِص لا تليق بجلاله. And it's called salbiya because the meaning of salb, right, is to remove something. So he said it removes any fault from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, anything that should not be given to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to remove these things. Right? So when you say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pre-existent, it removes that he was born. If you say post-existent, it removes that he will die. If you say mukhalafatul hawadith, it removes anything that says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is similar to creation. Qiyamu bi nafsi, it removes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in need of anything. Wal wahdaniyah removes that there is anybody, any other gods except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Salbiyat removes any fault, so anything that is not supposed to be given to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is sifatul ma'ani. Right? Sifatul ma'ani are attributes that are given that explain the meaning of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power. And there are 6 for example. We have Qudra, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ability. Right? Wal irada, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does what he wants and does what he wishes. Wal ilm, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most knowledgeable. Wal haya, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala all loving. Was sama, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all hearing. Wal basar, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all seeing. Wal kalam, that we explain now before it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's speech. This is what سميت بالمعاني لأنها أثبتت لله تعالى معاني وجودية تليق بكماله. It's called al-ma'ani because it explains. Ma'ana is a meaning, right? So it explains to us and it confirms the meanings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's presence, right? And it confirms and explains to us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is kamal, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is perfect, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is complete, right? It's called ma'ani. Nafsiya, salbiya, ma'ani, then you have ma'nawiya. Ma'nawiya is the last one. Ma'nawiya is also 6. Kawnu ta'ala qadir. Right? We say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we say is qadir. Right? He has qudra, has the ability, and he is al-qadir. Now we say kawnuhu ta'ala qadir. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, kawnu means that he's being, or that he is. Right? That he is able to do something. Wa kawnuhu muridan, that he is able to answer. وَكَوْنُهُ عَالِمًا, that he is the all-knowledgeable. وَكَوْنُهُ حَيًّا, that he is alive. وَكَوْنُهُ سَمِيعًا وَكَوْنُهُ بَصِيرًا وَكَوْنُهُ مُتَكَلِّمًا, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the all-hearing, he is the all-seeing, and is mutakalliman. وَهِيَ مُلَازِمَةٌ لِصِفَاتِ الْمَعَانِ. Mulazima meaning that it confirms, it continues, and it confirms the sifat before. Right? Ma'an, because Ma'an said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has al-qudra. Somebody can say that he had it in the past, but here the mulazama shows that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. Right? And some people would ask, what's the wisdom in mentioning the ma'nawi after you mention the ma'ani? We said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ability, why do we have to say that he is? Right? Said the hikmah anna dhalik, al-awwal, dhikr al-aqaid ala wajh tafsir. I think we explained this last week. Dhikr al-aqaid ala wajh tafsir. To explain Aqeedah in depth and break everything down, right? لأن الجهل في العقائد خطير, because arrogance in Aqeedah and arrogance in Tawheed is very dangerous, because arrogance can lead you to kufr. That's why we said, especially in Aqeedah, you don't read something by yourself. You ask somebody who understands, you ask somebody who learned, you ask a scholar. So this is لأن الجهل في العقائد بالعقائد خطير. That's the first reason why we said the ma'nawi, the ma'na and the ma'nawi, right? Because like we said, some people can say Allah he was the all-seeing. But now we're saying kawnu, that he is. So it confirms, right? And it explains it more into depth. Because the arrogant person will say that, no, Allah, it just says Sami'. So Allah was the all-seeing, right? That's why it says, Al-Jahl fil aqaid khatir, that arrogance in Aqeedah is dangerous. The second one is Raddu al-Mu'tazila. So that we can refute the Mu'tazila, فإنهم أنكروا صفات المعاني وقالوا أنه تعالى قادر بذاته مريدا بذاته عالم بذاته لكنهم لم يكفروا لأنهم قالوا أنه قادر بذاته وعالم بذاته. Because they say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His essence is able, right? And like we said, they basically making all these attributes that we mentioned in Ma'ani, they're putting it part of nafsiyah. They say the essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, right? And we broke it down. But the most important reason is the first one, right? So that we can understand and break through our arrogance, right? And the last part that we'll mention is the hukam. What's the ruling for somebody that doesn't believe in Sifat al-Ma'nawiyah, right? It says حكم من نفى صفات المعنوية في التفصيل إن نفاها وأثبت مع النفي ضدها فإن يكفر. If somebody refuses to believe any of the Sifat al-Ma'ani, right? Sifat al-Ma'nawiyah meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the all-seeing, that He is the all-hearing, right? If anybody refuses this, doesn't want to believe this, وأثبتت مع النفي ضدها, and while you refuse this, you say that no, you can't see, right? You believe the opposite, فَإِنَّهُ يَكْفُرُ. That is kufr, right? So if you do that. They give us a example for man, كَمَنْ نَفَى كَوْنُهُ عَالِمًا. Somebody says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not, now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not all knowledgeable, right? Say كَانَ عَالِمًا, but now he's not. كَوْنُهُ عَالِمًا, he is all knowledgeable. They say, why he believes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not all knowledgeable? He believes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is arrogant, kufr. Right? The second one is وَأَثْبَتَ ضِدِّهَا وَكَوْنُهُ جَاهِلًا. Okay. They says the second one is إِن نَفَى وَلَمْ يَثْبُتِ الدُّعَى. They say somebody that refuses to believe it, but he doesn't say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the opposite. Right? Example, he says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not kawnu aliman, he's not all knowledgeable now. Right? But he doesn't say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is arrogant. بمعنى أنه ينفي أي كون الله تعالى صفة قديمة. He says that at the same time he refused to understand, but at the same time he didn't attribute the opposite, right? Meaning, he says في نفس الوقت ومثبت لانكشاف الأشياء له تعالى بذات أزلا فلا ضرر في ذلك. Then he says that if he doesn't give the opposite, then we don't call him a kafir, right? That's why, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says لأنه حق نفي صفات الأحوال كما تقدم. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sometimes He removes the states. This one is very difficult to explain in English. Basically, He says that Allah, we say that if He doesn't say that Allah is the opposite, right? So He says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not kawnuhu aliman, but He doesn't say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is arrogant. Then he's not kafir, right? That one you just need to go explain to him afterwards. But he's not kafir. And then he says, حُكُمْ مَنْ نَفَى صِفَاتِ الْمَعَانِ. Ma'ani was the one before. Not kawnu aliman, assuming about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala having ilm, having knowledge. Is وَأَمَّا صِفَاتِ الْمَعَانِ فَإِنْ نَفَاهَا فَفِي التَّفْصِيلِ. If he refuses it, then there's tafsil. Tafsil means it has to be explained. It says, إِنْ نَفَى زِيَادَتُهَا عَلَى الذَّاتِ مَا إِثْبَاتَ أَحْكَامُهَا لِلَّهِ فَإِنْ ذَلِكَ مُوجِبٌ لِلْفِسْقِ وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. He says, if he refuses it, or refutes it, refutes it upon the essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, مَا إِثْبَاتَ أَحْكَامُهَا لِلَّهِ ta'ala, and he confirms the rulings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? فَإِنَّ ذَلِكَ فِسْقٌ. Is a fasiq. If you understand what a fasiq is, a fasiq is a hypocrite, right? But to understand what a fasiq is, if you were to look at, if you had an apple, right? And when you open the apple, sometimes the apple is rotten inside, it looks fine outside. When you open the apple, then you see worms and dirt is rotten inside, right? A fasiq is somebody where if you look at him, you won't see anything. But his heart is like a rotten apple, right? It's filled with dirt, it's filled with sin, it's filled with arrogance, right? That's a fasiq. He says, إِنَّ فَا مَا إِثْبَاتَ أَوْدَارِيَا فَإِنَّ يَكْفُرُ. So if he refuses it, this attribute, right? But he still makes confirm the rulings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then he's a fasiq. But if he refuses it and he confirms the opposite of this attribute, right, then he's kafir. Right? Then he's kafir. And that will be the end of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Understand the different attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then after that you start with the qism called Nabawiyat. Right? Something called Nabawiyat, in which you learn about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you learn about the prophets that are mentioned in the Quran. Right? You learn what is a prophet, what is a messenger, the difference that not all messengers are prophets, not all prophets are messengers. Not all messengers are prophets, not all prophets are messengers, but all messengers are prophets. Right? And we explain how you understand that, inshallah, in the next class. And then after that, you learn what is a prophet, and then you learn about each prophet, Sayyidina Adam, and you learn about him and his stories and all the prophets until we love Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then you go to the Malaika and you learn about the books and the scrolls and the day of Qiyamah, inshaAllah ta'ala. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the understanding and to make us of those who act upon what we've learned, and to make us of those who do not learn except through those who have learned, and to not learn through ourselves, and to not make shaitan our teacher. Inshallah. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.